So my name is Murray, and I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Poverty and Inequality at the University of Cape Town, and it truly is wonderful to welcome you all here today. But let's move into our first session, though. And as appropriate for a first session, it's a framing or contextual session that's supposed to put some key issues on the table that the onus then falls on us to pick up as the day goes on. It's called Inequality in an African Context. But immediately the attention does turn not just to inequality in general, but to the relationship between the labor market and inequality. So the labor market is a very key driver of inequality, and we want to probe that. We don't just want to say that, we want to probe it during the course of the day. And so even at this framing session, our three wonderful speakers are going to put something on the table for us for the rest of the day. Allow me then to just introduce them briefly to you. So Professor Ernest Aryeetey is the founding Secretary General of the African Research Universities Alliance, which is an alliance of a network of 16 of Africa's flagship universities. He is an economist. I don't think you can ever escape that. Even if you go on to greater things, you still are an economist. And he worked in the Institute for Statistical, Social and Economic Research at the University of Ghana before becoming a very eminent African commentator and research leader through Brookings on Africa, on the African Growth Initiative, and then the Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana. And so he's been working on these issues at the big picture level for a long, long time. And it's a privilege to have you with us, Ernest. Obviously, so there's the big economic issues, but then of course, as Alan and Bev were both saying, we're grappling at the interface here with the economic policy, but also the voices of people and their real livelihoods, and how do we actually triangulate all of that. And so it's really wonderful to have Bosani Baloyi from Oxfam South Africa with us today, who calls herself a development economist and activist. So what a perfect fit. That's exactly what Bev said, not a development economist, but a researcher and activist. And recently joined Oxfam, and has worked on industrial policy, and I won't go through all of that, but very eminent person. And then I think known to you all, what's called the Honorary Professor Trevor Manuel, right? That's an official title. That's not us deciding that. He is indeed an honorary professor at the University of Cape Town, former South African Minister of Finance, served as a cabinet minister under our first 4 presidents in our country, and has been very involved in the longer run planning through the National Planning Commission, to leading the National Planning Commission in South Africa to try and grapple with these tough issues that are on the agenda today. And so it's an amazing privilege to have, what a team to kick us off. I was given 3 minutes, right? There's very tight timing schedule here. So the idea really then is Ernest gives some broader framing of the relationship between unemployment, underemployment, and inequality, and then Bosani and Trevor then make sure we've got a forward-looking perspective in the day. We don't dwell just on on that. We get stuck into the labor market dynamics and the texture of what we're confronting here, and look forward as to, well, how are we supposed to respond? Because that's the focus of the day. And then it leaves us to the next session of Miriam, Caroline, and Maureen, really to take this further, and then to us. If you look at the program for the day, right, there's a heavy onus on our engagement as well. We're all in this together. Okay, so I'm done, and I'm going to call Ernest to the podium. The timing is postmodern. Like Ernest is given 12 minutes, so I don't know what sort of prompt I'm supposed to give. It shakes me out of my comfort zone anyway, and that's probably wonderful, right? But we want to leave ourselves with as close as possible to 25 minutes, to half an hour really of discussion time. So nobody's going to take exception if people are shorter. So thank you so much, Ernest.
Thank you very much, Murray. I thought I had 15 minutes, but let's see what we do with 12.
Structural adjustment.
Yeah. Well, just in case I run out of time, these are the points I basically want to make. The first being that Africa has indeed seen some fairly decent growth in the last 2 decades, but this has not really led to any significant employment growth. That's the first point I want to make. And from that, the absence of employment growth, we've seen inequality worsen in some places, and in other places, mild improvements have been recorded in terms of inequality. And we'll try to show some link between unemployment and inequality. And then we make also the point that the situation tends to be worse for younger people and also women. So some of the charts that I'll be showing will make this a lot clearer. And then towards the end of my presentation, I will show a few interventions that have taken place in a number of African countries, including here in South Africa. I make the point that despite these interventions that have been introduced in various countries, the outcomes have been far less than expected. And then I do talk about the fact that inequality research in Africa is quite rare. There are very few. If you try to Google inequality research in Africa, most of the things that you find, and then there are not many of them, they come from South Africa. Almost every significant study of inequality, unemployment in Africa comes from South Africa. And most of it is either in the name of Murray Librand or Harun Barat. So that has to change. That has to change. We've got to see a lot more being done in Africa. And that, of course, we can't do that without people like Murray. That's why within the African Research University Alliance, we've set up a new Center of Excellence for Inequality Research, being championed by Murray here. And I think there are some pamphlets that Murray has brought to show you what the center is going to do. The idea is to grow significantly the number of African researchers working on the poverty and inequality matters. So in every single African country, we will find clear evidence of whether policy works or not. And if policy is not working, why doesn't it work so we can change it? So these are the things I would like to show in my... So I begin with my first slide of basically making the point that there has been significant growth in Africa. Significant in the sense that even when the world was performing badly, African growth did better than most parts of the world. That's the very first point we want to make. And that growth has seen us survive the financial crisis. That growth, in the times when things were very difficult for the rest of the world, remained. It may not be great. It may not be as great as we've seen in China in the past, but it's still better than in many developed parts of the world. And we are also happy to point out the fact that even though it has led to significant drops in poverty in many parts of the region, it still remains that Africa is one of the poorest regions in the world. It is indeed the poorest region in the world. So you can see from this chart, yes, poverty has come down, and yet it's one of the highest in the world. Of course, it varies from country to country. We can make that point. They are still the poorest countries in the world are here. Of course, the trend also, we mentioned about inequality remains there. You see the moderate long-term decline in inequality in Africa between 1991 and 2015. We see that. You see the oscillation around the movement and the Gini. What is important is the fact that there is still very high incidence of inequality in Africa, and it's driven by a small number of countries. So there's inequality in Africa. It's improved in some countries, but it's still, African inequality is basically a South African inequality story. It's quite bad. It also affects many other countries. Even in the places where inequality has gone down slightly, you find that within those countries, the spatial inequality is quite vast. Take a place like Ghana, my own country. The gap between the North and the South is huge, and it's growing. It's growing, So even in the places where there's a good story to come out, the bad story also lingers, and that's the point that we seek to make there. The link between unemployment and inequality in Africa, I just cite these 3 studies to show that there's a link between unemployment and inequality in Africa. For you, many South Africans, the second study here from Trigana and Etela are probably the most relevant. It shows you what happens when you decompose the earnings inequality and the link between that and employment status. It's quite revealing. There are a few other studies that have been done that bring out the same picture. So there's no denying the fact that the African inequality story is linked to the ability to earn income from employment. That's the important point that we want to make over there. Of course, we do show the trends in terms of unemployment. Unemployment figures in Africa are quite difficult to find. And even when you find them, they are not considered reliable. That's one of the things that people like Murray have been telling us for a long time. Unemployment figures in Africa are extremely difficult and very challenging to work with. But what they do show is that there are different types of unemployment. And then within the unemployment that we see, the data that we see, the role that underemployment plays in there is also very significant, as it tends to mask a lot of what we would otherwise have called unemployment. But what they do, the figures that we have do show is that, yes, they are quite high in many places. It has been so for many years. There's that very little declining there. The fact is that for women, it's a lot more than for men. That's the point that we use. So basically, there's high unemployment among women than among men. That's the point we make. And also the issue of youth unemployment is quite vast and growing in many of our countries. There's a lot of challenge in terms of defining the youth in Africa. Many different countries define it differently. If we took the UN definition focused on the 15 to 24s, there's every indication that this group has suffered quite a bit in terms of finding jobs. I always make the example in my own country of saying that, look, for many of the young people, as many as 60% of the young people who were leaving my university, they were not likely to find a job within the first 2 years. And that's something that needs to be taken seriously. And it goes, in the past, one would say that if you went to a university and you took a degree in the liberal arts, you were likely to suffer that. Today, in the STEM subjects, they have that same problem. There are engineers in Africa who are not finding jobs. There are medics, there are pharmacists in Africa who are not finding jobs. So it's not simply a matter of what you study. So the unemployment among the youth figures is quite vast. This chart shows that it varies from place to place, even though we're not the worst off in terms of regional representation. It is very significant in Africa. And again, it shows that the position for women tends to be a lot more precarious than for men. What I do here is present some figures for a number of countries. Clearly, there's a lot of variation across countries, where you can look at a place like Mozambique and Botswana, compare that to other countries, Burkina Faso, Niger, where these are much smaller. But the variation across country is quite huge. I don't show here the South African region. I don't want to frighten you, I just left that one out. Now, of course, we go to the fact that in many of our countries, when people are looking for jobs, the obvious place to turn is the informal sector. It has become an alternative for finding employment, but that has its own problems and challenges. The biggest challenge there is the issue of underemployment in that sector. It's one that we haven't really addressed. Many people think that the informal sector is the solution to Africa's. It could be, but there are a lot of things that we need to do to make that happen. So there's in the paper itself a lot of discussion of how underemployment plays out. The link between underemployment and the youth unemployment is discussed broadly in the paper. And of course, the fact that it's sort of must, the situation we also discuss. And they provide figures on the time-related youth underemployment in selected African countries, showing that it is vast from place to place, and that's something that governments will have to deal with in order to move on. And I said that various countries are doing something about it. We talk about things that South Africa has done, providing skills training and employment subsidies, for example. We talk about the National Rural Youth Service Corps, the publicly funded institutions that are clearly supporting vocational education in this part of the world. It's all discussed in the paper. We give examples from Uganda, the challenges with lending and investment. Also, the idea being to give young people some new skills that will make them likely candidates for credit from various institutions. That's also discussed. I give a snapshot of what's going on in Ghana. The various new programs initiated by a government intended to give young people skills that will make them credit worthy, also discussed in the paper. I talk about Nigeria and the evaluations of these, and then we talk about some of the cross-cutting lessons that have been drawn from the national examples or the efforts. The most important thing is that our observation made by analysts is that these programs seldom target the beneficiaries properly. Even though they are meant for the young people, very, very seldom do you find proper targeting being done. So as a result of that, lots of money gets spent in every country on trying to create jobs for the youth, and yet the outcomes are often very difficult to ascertain. We talk about government-sponsored vouchers and subsidies that could provide solutions, but obviously in my own country, examples of that being abused are quite obvious. The employment data problem needs to be tackled, and then the need for us to think about quality jobs. So not only about the number of jobs, but having quality jobs. A number of things could be done to address youth unemployment. The first important thing that we think must be considered is the mainstreaming of youth employment in policy strategies. In many countries, addressing the youth issues is an afterthought. Once you've done everything else, in education, in health, in transportation, and agric, and you think about the youth, that probably is one of the biggest problems. We believe strongly that addressing the labor market issues is something that needs to be taken directly up front. We've seen over 30 years of steady growth in many countries, and we've seen the absence of sound jobs being created in the process. So we've got to do something about it. We've got to have a more direct way of creating jobs, and also a more direct way of creating jobs for younger people and also for women. We talk about the need to make sure that employment generation, the growth that is going to lead to employment generation is more directed and oriented towards how do you do that? The kind of growth that you get comes from the type of investments that you make. And we make the point in the paper that that needs to be addressed properly. The skills mismatch through quality teaching and learning must be properly pursued and properly structured. Entrepreneurship for the youth programs, there are several. They are going to work. Let's evaluate them. These days, there are many good ways of doing evaluations, and the same for public works programs. And of course, we've got to arrest the population growth rates. There are still a number of African countries where fertility rates remain very, very high. They remain very, very high, despite the fact that they've fallen in many parts of the region. We've got to do something about it. And when we've done all of these things, we have every reason to believe that we would be able to tackle the challenge of youth unemployment and underemployment. Thank you.
Hello. Ooh, it's cool. We're good. Thank you so much to the conference organizers for this opportunity. I was called in at the last minute, so wish me luck. No, it's, yeah, someone couldn't make it, so I was happy to when I saw the panel. So I've been asked to speak on the topic of the youth and underemployment, what is to be done. I would like to start with the statistic that I think captures at least one dimension of underemployment, and this is that 5 million graduates across the continent are either unable to find work or only able to find menial work that is unrelated to their qualifications or are underemployed. Now, this, of course, is a huge challenge in terms of unemployment and underemployment in Africa and the inequalities that it causes. But when you read some of the literature in terms of how this issue or challenge is framed, the reason for the staggering unemployment figure is said to be only because of a notion of a skills mismatch. What the literature would say is that what the labor market needs to fill this employment gap is for students to be better skilled in various kinds of subject matters, which the education system across our continent is simply not delivering. Ernest just spoke about how we have engineers and yet they are not able. And in fact, this is what is also said by industry players. So with the CEO of Coca-Cola for West Africa saying that universities are churning out students that are incompetent and in need of retraining. Therefore, there needs to be a way that the skills or human capital that is developed is responsive to what industry needs. But what we need to keep in mind is that industry is always evolving faster than what the education system is able to generate, right? Because there are long lead times. And industry delivers in such a way that it does not necessarily think about people because central to its objective is the maximization of profit above what people need, in my opinion. So more and more of what we see in even the labor-intensive sectors, and I'll talk about the South African economy, is the implementation of new technologies to replace the human labor workforce, not only of what is considered unskilled labor, but also what is considered skilled labor. So today's skilled labor may be tomorrow's unskilled. So we need to think about what this so-called skills mismatch is, or we need to think about it very differently. We need to think about it, in my opinion, as a question of power, as functional and also dysfunctional to the capitalist system. Functional to the capitalist system because it allows capitalists to reduce costs without dealing with human error, without dealing with complaints, without dealing with strikes, etc., in order to maximize profit. But it is also dysfunctional to the system because this all depends on whether or not capital is able to realize its profits through those that it unemploys or underemploys. And we have seen the tactic to use debt as an escape route so that people can purchase the things that the system produces. But even this has its limits. Hence, we have the global financial crisis. So I'm not here to answer the question or give a solution. I was told to frame. But I will try to throw some ideas and perhaps it start something. So my position on this is clear and may not be clear to everyone, or people may not agree. And I will talk about what should not be done first. What should not be done for me is the youth wage subsidy, which was highly debated by policymakers, intellectuals, and journalists. And this is the idea that a subsidy must be provided in order to capital in order to incentivize the employment of the youth. Now, if you read the scholarship where this has been implemented, it has always been implemented in the global north, in industrialized countries. And indeed, there seems to be an ambivalence about the potential success of this, having read some of the literature. In fact, the World Bank report said it could have positive effects, but depending on how it is designed and framed. But what the report has also alerted us to is that there is a high potential for substitution effects, where we replace old workers with young. And similarly, the World Development Report in 2013 was more critical, where it said that aggregated employment effects of wage subsidies are low at best. We also, of course, need to look at the impacts of youth unemployment and the wage subsidy, because these policies cannot be implemented without thinking about the context we're in. So I will speak from the perspective of the South African context. So when National Treasury of South Africa was presenting this policy position, again, most of the examples were again from the global north, with the closest being similar being Colombia. And of course, this policy proposal needs to be anchored in, sorry, I'm repeating. So as Sipho mentioned last night in the keynote for the welcoming reception of the conference, labor and capital in South Africa are in this standoff. And this standoff is highly political, it's highly historical. The 1970s and 80s were a time where the labor movement really shook the system and made massive gains, which were then consolidated into our labor legislation. However, since 1994, we have seen a reversal of these gains with the spate of casualization of the workforce and the accelerated growth of the labor brokers, which has fragmented and weakened the working class, creating underemployment and unemployment, and pitting the younger or the new to the workforce against the older. So this has happened, right? So therefore, when the labor movement says that there will be this kind of substitution effect that will fragment the working class, it is not saying this outside of a context of politics. It's not saying this outside of a context of history. It's saying this within a context of a historical process and embedded within a class struggle. So in terms of some ideas of what can be done, there are some in the socialist movement and some billionaires who will argue that let us accept the tendency towards automation, or the continuance towards automation is indeed the future of work, or as I would say, it's the future is here. They would argue that we should not look at the unemployment it creates as a bad thing necessarily. Rather, we should look at it as a good thing, because it frees us from enslavement from a capitalist system, which enslaves us, because now we have the leisure time to pursue what we actually want. But of course, we cannot just eat leisure, right? So they would argue that let us tax capital. Let us tax the machines. We slap a hefty equalizing wealth tax type of a tax. That's what they would say. Okay, I hope. This may have the possibility to actually incentivize capital to reverse automation. That may be one indication, so that it starts to think about humans in the design of its work process. And we can use the proceeds or revenues for the social good or the collective goods that we need to meet our basic needs. However, this model may perhaps fit in the South African context, wherein dispossession and proletarization and some form of industrialization has taken place through the so-called minerals and energy complex, where a highly capital-intensive system of accumulation has been achieved. However, would it fit the rest of the continent, or is there a need for such? I'm not sure. I haven't thought that far, to be honest. However, what I would say is that there may still be a need for industrialization, and there is the need for industrial policy, but the challenge is how do we do it in a labor-saving way? How do we ensure that there isn't this race to the bottom that results in the downward pressure in the workforce, the massive land dispossession that happens across the continent in Mozambique and Ethiopia, which is now seen as this poster child of development? Is there a way of democratizing this process to ensure an emancipatory and participatory type of development? I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. It's okay. Each year, at the end of January, the ILO produces the WESO, the World Economic and Social Outlook, and it's read partly because what it does on an annual basis is to provide both the data for the previous year's unemployment, country by country, region by region, and then provides an outlook for the period ahead. So WESO clearly is alone in its league in providing that kind of data set. I want to talk about, or just introduce the topic, because the panel that follows will deal with African labor markets in a bit more detail. Along with that report, there's also the Global Wage Report. Read together, I think it makes a very interesting reading. And so if you look at the WESO for 2018, the sub-Saharan African unemployment figure comes in at 7.9%. Now, as Ernest said, a lot of the data that we're familiar with is South African data, but I can't help but try and interrogate what that 7.9% is all about, partly because the very same source, the ILO, would provide us with definitions on both broad and narrow unemployment. It would provide us with the definitions of decent work. And so how do you arrive at 7.9% across the African continent? It somewhat boggles the mind, and so part of what I want to do is try and look at this issue. And my broad thesis would be that if we as Africans can't own up to data sets, then we'll never manage the problem. We'll always pretend it's somebody else's problem and be self-satisfied with the fact that at 7.9%, we're heading towards full employment, problem solved. I asked our former statistician general for whether he had access to some numbers from Pan-African experiences through the UNECA or one or other of the bodies that he serves on. And he shared with me an interesting but unpublished data set. And what it does across the continent is to take the published figures for NEET and unemployment. And the variances are staggering. In fact, there are reasonable close approximations for a number of southern African countries, including South Africa, Lesotho, Mozambique. But across the continent, the variances are so big. So in Nigeria, for instance, the number or the percentage of those not in employment, education, or training is 5 times that of the unemployment statistic. So it just can't hold true. Nothing can hold true from this annual publication that the ILO provides us with. And so if there's a body of work that we need to get into, I'd suggest that that would be the first. Let's go back to the ILO definitions, broad and narrow for unemployment. Let's try and understand work, and if you read the body of or supporting literature that the ILO uses, in many countries there are all manner of questionnaires that we are told are complied with. But in many instances, the data sets are so old now. The data set available for Kenya is a 1999 data set, and Zambia 2005. So I'm suggesting that it's not very useful to debate Pan-African issues unless we have reliable data sets that we can utilize and beat each other up, because we beat ourselves up all the time. south of the Limpopo about the data sets. But we need a different discourse about the issues, clearly, so that we can sink our teeth into what it really is all about. And we need that to understand better some of the possible interventions, and they relate to both education and training, but they also relate to a series of public policy issues that would be precursors to changing the outlook generally. What's happening in healthcare, what's happening in infrastructure spending, what kind of infrastructure is being spent on, and how does all of this come together in creating employment, and what are the work readiness programs to deal with this. So in the absence of this, to abstract labor market issues, I think creates enormous difficulties for us. And part of the problem that the non-discussion of public policy is about is the fact that in many instances, as a result of years of programs from Bretton Woods institutions, and also the way in which ODA is structured for countries, there isn't actually the policy room to deal with these issues. So everybody ambles along in survivalist mode, failing to deal with issues that would transform economies, focus on modernization, focus on improving opportunities, deal with a whole range of issues, be this in the urban space, and urbanization is, of course, a great aggregator of opportunity, and we know what the numbers are. Ernest referred to the ruralness of the African continent, and Edgar Peterson, who will be here this afternoon, I think, has written about the fact that in governments everywhere across the African continent, especially post-liberation governments, we tend to say we're not spending on the urban environment because we're dealing with rural development. But that's because there are no television cameras that get into the rural environment to see that there's no spending there either. So there's no spending on quality of life issues. And so labor markets on their own, I think, would always be severely constrained in their ability to deal with issues if the job opportunities are not created by the way in which public spending leads in other forms of spending. And of course, if there's no lead from the public sector, then there won't be crowding in from the private sector, and so economies won't grow. And so the big challenge that confronts us is that even as African economies grew, according to the WESO last year, by 3.7%, if you abstract from that the lift that comes from commodity prices, there isn't actually much by way of inclusive growth. So we have to get our heads into that part of it as well. So we've got a set of comparators that help us work through these issues in quite a calm and rational way, so we understand what's happening in the quality of life of people. Another aspect to consider is flows into the continent, and the biggest source of flows right now would be remittances. The World Bank, in a recently published report, uses a low figure of $39 billion of remittances. And there's a different report by an outfit called Afripedia that speaks of $63 billion of remittances. A lot of it actually removed by all manner of intermediaries who feed off the remittances, and so very little actually lands on the continent. But somewhere between 39 and 63 is probably where the real number is. But what that does suggest is that when labor markets fail on the continent, skilled Africans move into the diaspora. And in that desperation to get out or get off the continent, annually thousands of bodies end up in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. It's understanding that aspect of it as part of the failure of African labor markets that I think we need to give a different attention to. Not in a manner that that tries to denigrate people who, in their desperation, leave. But I think repeatedly we must develop a perspective about why it is that people who frequently are skilled and able are so desperate to leave the continent. My own analysis would suggest that this is part of what we need to factor into the non-functioning of African labor markets. And then, of course, a series of issues Ernest spoke about, not just job creation as a consequence, but also government spending on a range of issues of job creation, of assistance, of the reduction of the costs of job seeking. And then, in that ongoing battle between formal and informal, to ask a series of questions about which governments have inspectorates at all. Because it's very easy to provide the ILO with legislation passed and regulation passed, and never any verification of what the reality is in the lives of people. So I think that it may sound like an odd bureaucratic point, but I think a necessary one to deal with in the context of the labor market. The last point I want to make is whether there's a linkage between the, initiatives such as the new Continental Free Trade Area, which seeks to enlarge opportunities across the continent, and actually the policy direction taken within countries. Whether the one is not of the Minister of Trade and the other the Minister of Industry, will never see eye to eye about these issues. And so we can tick a series of boxes, but the most important boxes where they matter is in the lives of working people in general, and then the more vulnerable groups, young people and women in particular. My suggestions are that we need to refocus on how labor market data are actually compiled and what we can do to drive change from that basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those platform inputs, as I've just decided to call them, for all of us to engage with. Now I hope you've all been busy on Slido, right? Never heard of it until this morning, I have to say, myself. It's going to come up. This is sort of a type of a local level democracy, right? Because you've tabled your questions, and apparently there's even been some voting on the questions. But anyway, I want to, whilst we set up the Slido, technology always follows rather than leads. Don't believe that. Is somebody out there who wants to frame something? I'm going to give you a once-off opportunity to bypass Slido. I mean, those were wonderful. Wasn't that a sort of a daunting counterposition of the NEETs, for example, right? Those people who are in a no person's land, those young people with their potential to offer society, and they're in a no person's land. And then on the other hand, you've got this vision so nicely sketched by all three speakers of a skilled young cohort who flee to urban areas to avoid whatever is the reality of their lives at the local level in the rural areas. Or who flee abroad. And they're both on the agenda, and they're both a huge loss to our society, and they're both at the heart of a lack of inclusive growth. So Ernest sketched the scenario where we grow, but it's not inclusive. Please, Mohammed. The most popular ones. Okay.
A lot of the first panel speaker was the interventions on the beneficiaries, the unemployed and the unemployed youth. But taking a systemic and structural understanding of inequality would necessitate looking at even what we're doing at the top. So is there any research that indicates that in the countries where that focus was taken, what happened to inequality, rather than the old classical and neoclassical approaches of focusing on the unemployed creating jobs and focusing on the youth, for example. So policies that looked at the rate at which accumulation and the rich were getting richer, and putting caps on that and trying to address both ends of the inequality spectrum. Is there any research of the countries that had those kinds of progressive policies? And what's the data on that?
I'm going to twin that to a question that's got a large chunk of the popular vote on, hopefully not populism, but the popular vote, on Slido. And it says, are we confident that inequality and the exclusion of so many youth can be addressed with our current economic model? It links a bit to that question from Mohammed. Let's let the panel take that.
Thank you very much. To your question, basically, I think the best examples of how broader policy changes can lead to positive outcomes in terms of inequality reduction will not be found in Africa. Latin America offers the best examples, and I think the one that is most cited is what you found in Brazil and also in Chile. These are some of the best cited examples. When you come to Africa, it's got a largely difficult situation with the data. It's very difficult to be equally conclusive. But the anecdotal material would suggest that there's a lot of good coming out of Rwanda. There's a lot of good coming out of Rwanda. People like to dismiss it and say, look, it's a very, it's a much less democratic society. It's a dictatorship that is leading to that. I mean, there are many reasons. But whatever it is, there's something happening in Rwanda that's worth looking at. So that's my take on the question.
Thank you for the question. I'll try and respond as best as I can. As you know, Oxfam globally has been looking at inequality for the last several years. And its key focus has been on the 1%, the 10%, which you are referring to. So moving away from problematizing the poor, but actually problematizing the wealthy. So if you were here at yesterday's keynote address, you would have heard from our executive director, who was using Christo and his peer as symbolic of, symbols of a highly dysfunctional system. Now, so we've been coming up with these reports, and what our struggle has been is that in terms of the Africa data set, much of it has come from South Africa. So this is how we came up with 3 South Africans own 50% of the bottom, you know. And that is because in the rest of the continent, in our continent, like, the data is really sparse. And so now there's this move towards having country reports where we can actually try and build kind of like a data set within that and look at wealth, for instance, right? And so this is something that is highly challenging. Looking at wealth anywhere in the world is challenging, even in industrialized countries, because no one wants to report that. Who wants to show that? So there's the use of tax, I think tax data, that is usually what is used, but it only declares so much. So I think the most current study that we have is one, I forgot her name, bless her, but she's at Stellenbosch, where she produced a study that looked at the fact that, you know, yes, that's it, 10% or 90% of the wealth. Although, and even within that, there's a problem with that data set because she only uses tax, and there's a whole range of things that are not reported. So even that is a scary statistic. But you're right. We haven't looked at that. Piketty has some world whatever report, but we haven't been looking at it like internationally, and this is where it should move. This is the new level of granularity, and it's going to be difficult because there is, like where there are tax havens and all these things, it becomes a huge challenge. Yeah, so thank you for the question.
It actually is a very difficult issue at a global level. If one looks at China, which just over 30 years ago arguably had an incredibly low Gini coefficient. The notion of the iron rice bowl was very prominent, and then change was introduced. And China, about 5 years ago, overtook the US in respect of its Gini coefficient. We need to try and understand what drives that. We need to understand where the premiums are that actually attract that kind of disparity that takes root very quickly. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect which I think is quite important to understand is that whereas at the turn of the last century, when antitrust legislation was introduced, it was because of the patterns of accumulation through oil and steel and a number of other big smoke-belching industries. But the bigger accumulation now, and probably find you can track this through the donors, even of those who brought us here together, is technology. IT has made so many people, especially on the west coast of the United States, so wealthy in such a short space of time. And what that does is to provide lead indicators and everything else attaches to it. And the thing that we haven't been able to resolve, and I haven't seen any studies, Mohammed, I haven't seen any studies that talk about how you remunerate equivalent skills who may be working in the same company. So you're a hotshot software engineer working for Microsoft in Ghana. How are you remunerated, on the one hand, relative to your peers who might be sitting in Silicon Valley, as opposed to the rest of the Ghanaian society? These are issues we haven't been able to get our heads around. I haven't seen any comparable studies. I don't know quite how you cap these issues, but it's fundamentally important because what happens at a global level and what happens in countries that are already much wealthier doesn't sit very comfortably. And that is not to dispute the fact that if you had data, it would be interesting to see in a country like Nigeria what the presence of the Dangotes and so on do to raise the Gini coefficient, because Dangote is not the only exceedingly wealthy Nigerian, but what does it do? In the absence of data, we pretend that it isn't there. But the truth is that we must actually get into data so that we can get a different management, a policy approach to dealing with the reality of inequality.
So somebody asked a question here, and I've just lost it because my Slido management. But it was about it resonated with some of the comments from the panel, and even in the question about do we actually know enough about the very top end of the income distribution and the super rich, as it's called, in Africa, and do we understand how they make their wealth, accumulate their wealth, because it's a part of understanding how countries actually work. Because that's the thing about a focus on inequality, right? We mustn't pathologize the poor, as another comment said here. We must understand how our society hangs together, and the inequality framework is the right way to do that, and understanding these patterns of accumulation and growth. And I think that what the panel was saying in answer to that question about do we understand the top end, well, not nearly enough. Because we need the wealth. It's not, income data won't just do the trick, and data don't speak for themselves either. We do need these wealth data, and in the African context in particular, what are wealth and assets That's not the same thing as everywhere else. It doesn't resonate exactly what Joseph Stiglitz is writing about or what Piketty is writing about. And that's our own challenge, our own burden. There was an excellent question about the fact that we've located one of the dangers of moving so quickly to African inequality is that we then don't frame it in the global context. And so what do we want to say about the international context in coming back then into the African context? And I thought maybe the panel would like to talk about that a bit.
Okay, so the question is, how do we think about the global context? Sorry?
Yes, well, globalization, obviously, there's a whole school of thought that thinks that the whole inequality discussion is a discussion about globalization.
Mm-hmm.
And so for us to have reached so quickly, so swiftly into the African context without thinking about the linkages to the global economy, the global world, globalizing world, what do we want to say about that?
Definitely, I would agree with that. That we need to think since the 70s or 80s with neoliberalism and Thatcherism and Reaganomics, what we have seen is this tendency towards inequality, and within that, hold on, let me just think about this. When Trump comes and he talks to the what's it, the belt? What's that belt called? The Rust Belt, which is former steel, automotives, and the deindustrialization that's taken place there. I mean, that basically speaks to a reversal in what that part of the world has been accustomed to, and how capital has been quick in shifting to various parts, but always in its shift, again, there's a downward pressure towards labor and a mass accumulation within that. So we cannot obviously think about inequality outside of that context. And I mean, we're in Africa, of course we can't, right? We've always been inserted into global accumulation through colonialism. And you know, the development, some would say the development of Europe is the underdevelopment of Africa, and there is always this kind of relationship. But what is interesting is that the very same ways in which capital or let's just say that in Europe, the kind of social contract between capital and labor, which allowed the dysfunction of capital to only continue within Africa, yet protect its own labor force, right, through the welfare system or wealth, the nation, the wealth. I forgot the term. Sorry, I'm all over. I'm all muddled up. But that social contract broke down in the 80s, right? And neoliberalism was introduced, and that is a model that everyone else has had to follow. So definitely we can't. I mean, Gabriel Palmer had a paper in which he shows that this idea of the Kuznets, the inverted U, breaks down. So this idea that before it gets this idea that it gets better, no, before it gets better, it gets worse, actually does not actually exist. It gets worse and it gets worse. So this idea of us converging to some form of equality where developed countries are, okay, that is breaking down, right? And yes, we have to think about these processes as interrelated. So definitely I would agree. Sorry.
Look, I mean, there is the distinction. I think the point that Marie made earlier, which is the body of Piketty's work, which is intergenerational wealth on the one hand versus newly acquired wealth on the other, I think is actually quite an important distinction, and that if a lot of Piketty's work would be drawn from the still current European experience. What I find a lot more interesting to look at is what is happening in developing countries, which is why I went to China, because that's a different body of evidence, and I think it's quite important to factor in China into global supply chains and what that does. What the distinction is between investors who go in, and perhaps there's a very good example in a company like Foxconn, which manufactures all of the electronics for Apple, Samsung, and a range of other companies. What people earn in that large city called Foxconn, and the investors who happen to be in Taiwan or on the island of Taiwan. How these processes play out, and what urbanization does, and what the drivers are there. And similarly, I think we must look to India, where there has been a very recent spike, with some people accumulating primarily off the back of new kinds of industrial sectors, and then more recently, a very strong pushback from the central bank to call in the debts that private banks who are sitting with a range of very highly leveraged individuals and groups, what the impact of that will be going forward. But these are trends that I think that we must understand. Similarly, in the much vaunted Brazil, there's an interesting data set that comes through from Brazil, that virtually all of the CEOs and directors of companies, largely in Sao Paulo and beyond, are white males. I think in a country like South Africa, everybody would be appalled by the fact that there's been no transformation of anything. The patterns remain very much the same, but largely because there have been government programs that have worked a lot better to deal with the worst ravages of inequality and support families primarily by investing in women and their children. That made a difference. But the ability to maintain that over the longer term, I think, is something that we must continue to keep our finger on the pulse of. And the comparison between what has happened in Brazil and Mexico, for instance, I think is also important. And then a series of questions. Why it is that even where Africans accumulate wealth very rapidly, it's still primarily off natural resources, rather than finding a route into the same global supply chains in the same way that India has. What is it about us as Africans that kind of creates the poverty traps on the one hand and the obstacles to industrialization on the other? These are, I think, parts of the discussions that we must have about inequality in the African continent and then the global context as well.
Thank you. I think everything has been said, especially the points that Trevor just made. 30 years ago, it would have been very, very normal to think about the gap, the widening gap between the North and the South. We always thought in terms of the inequality of the world as between the rich North and then the poor South. Within the intervening years, we've seen a number of countries that were in the South that have moved upwards and joined the North in so many different ways. So the North has become a little bigger than it used to be, and the South has become a little smaller than it used to be. With all of these changes that have taken place, we've also seen in our own immediate environment a number of things that are happening. Today, we see rich men in our own neighborhood they were not there before. What does it mean for us? How do we explain the crime that takes place in the neighborhood with the widening the gap between the rich and the poor? It is these new developments that have forced us, whether we like it or not, to focus a lot more on the inequality in the South. Today, I see how African countries have become far less equal than they were 30 years ago. So I should be interested in that. And I see how the gap between the South and the North has reduced somewhat as a result of countries like China and India, Brazil moving up. So yes, the world is changing. And so we can't afford to hold on to the things that were most important 30 years ago. I'm not saying at all that the gap between the North and the South is immaterial, but there is something more immediate, something more pressing, which is the gap between, just in the case of Ghana, between the rural and urban area, between the North and the South, between the man and the woman. These are more urgent for me as somebody who lives here than that between the US and Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those answers. So, I mean, it seems clear that across the presentations and then across these engagements already, that we're seeing the sort of the unhelpfulness of things like the Kuznets curve. So this is this thing that where, you know, when you grow, first inequality worsens, but then somehow inexorably it gets better in the process of growth, which was derived as a sort of a cross-country hypothesis. So notions of that Kuznets curve, or even growth convergence, because Africa, as Ernest pointed out, was growing faster than other countries, but aren't particularly helpful to us. They're not particularly helpful to the youth in their livelihoods, because it's all about the texture of growth. And so, and we've all said that in different ways. So in a sense, if we need to feel some comfort of actually saying something firm, it's that, right? So it's all about the texture of these social processes. There's a hard question for us here that we need to put on the table. Why is the panel not gender balanced? And why are there no unemployed or underemployed young black women on the panel? Okay, so Basani says she was unemployed, and maybe you're underemployed. Are you feeling underemployed, or are you feeling too busy? But still, you know, one point just then in on behalf of the organizers is that Hilma Moat was supposed to be on this panel, right, and was unfortunately her flight was cancelled from Togo to Accra. So structural forces intervened about that. And so I'm not sure whether she would have answered whether she's underemployed or not. But anyway, that's just on behalf of the panel. I don't know if there's anybody want to respond to that. Yes, Alan.
I just want to also mention the original chair for this panel was Najwa Idris, who would have been able to respond or engage with some of the questions about the effectiveness or otherwise of subsidies, because she manages the Treasury program of trying to support employment. She wasn't able to come because of Eid, so she was also one of the factors why some of the, you know, that also influenced the composition of some of the panel.
Perhaps let's allow us a luxury. If there's anybody who wants to say anything from the floor, just in response to the discussion so far, in a very pithy way, just table it, and it's on the agenda then for the rest of the day.
Maybe a solution would be to have someone from Women on Farms join you.
Joining the panel.
right. They won the award last night.
Well, that's a great idea. Is there someone from Women on Farms? Anyway, let's take another comment while we'd welcome an input from them.
Can I sit? Or do I have to stand? Okay, so thank you very much. I thought the inputs were very, very thought-provoking. My name is Itumile, and I work for a donor here in Cape Town. I've just got 3 short points, not solutions at all, but maybe just addition to the framing. The first is I didn't quite hear an analysis of the role of politics and power in the conversation around inequality on the continent, and the deliberate underdevelopment and the fact that power has played a very intrinsic role in the underdevelopment of Africa, in the perpetuation of inequality on the continent, because power brokers make decisions based on what they politically think is expedient. And so it's important for us to consider how those decisions are made and how the North influences the global South in that aspect. The second thing I didn't quite hear was around climate change. And I think any solutions that we try to come up with today, tomorrow, next year, if they don't consider how devastating the impact of climate change is going to be on these questions, then I think we're really missing the boat. The third thing that I didn't quite hear come out is the role of tech and innovation, which I think is what we should be focusing on if we're talking about leapfrogging, I guess, and also resolving some of the inequality questions that we have. And I think it might have been equally helpful to have a young person who is in the tech and innovation space to give us a little bit more information about how that can help us think through solutions. Thank you.
On that last point, maybe during the course of the day, somebody can input on that. It's in the structure, and that's a great point, and it mustn't be lost. Well, they're all great points, actually. I don't want to comment on all the comments. They were made for all of us. Anybody else want to make another comment before I take a slide over?
I just think, taking the data and information that's needed for evidence-based decision-making at a global scale to another level, we really need to pick at the conceptual foundations of what we mean by things like the workforce. Is our concept of the workforce an inclusive concept? Does it include anybody who could be working? Does it include people from across the globe? That example and comparison between Ghana and California with a software developer. I mean, are those two people considered equal in our conceptualization, our human conceptualization of who this labor force constitutes? And then we also need to say, well, how do we enable equity for all from this force that exists for labor for all? And I think we need to go back to some foundational thinking around this, because we tend to take the current global economy, the current situation as the sort of given, and we need to reconceptualize how the world could be under a different labor dispensation and under a different economic dispensation, and then gather our information according to definitions and concepts that are fitting for that.
Perhaps the panel just wants to reflect on what they've heard very briefly. Back again.
On the question of power, I fully agree. I think I tried to make that point within my presentation around that we can't frame underemployment within the skills mismatch. Understanding there is power that is involved in making decisions about what kinds of technologies we use, why we use them. We're maximizing profits, we're trying to reduce costs, we don't want to think about strikes, so those are issues of power. Those are issues of fragmenting the working class, right? And extracting from it as a way of accumulating. That is my frame, right? I think within that frame. And equally so, something that I didn't mention in terms of when talking about Reaganomics and Thatcherism, that was a question of power. So that came from power. That breakdown between labor and capital that happened was a way in which the capitalist elite kind of like reconfigured to deal with the fall in the rate of profit, right, in Europe. That's again my understanding. So that's a question of power, and of course it was relational, in the sense that what they had resolved during the post-war in that contract, in which Africa was affected in that contract. That disintegration is now, we are seeing it in their inequality, right? Again, a question of power. And one other statistic that I came across, or a report that I came across through the IMF, was to say that, in fact, since 1975, there have only been 7 countries that have moved up the income per capita from low to higher. Only 7 countries. And those 7 countries are mostly from Europe. So it's your Greece, it's your Portugal, it's those southern cone countries. So even though China has grown in terms of its income per capita, it has not been able to go up to that level of high income per capita. And we need to think about why, when we think about those who have managed that upward trajectory. And I would gather it, again, being a question of power in terms of European integration and what that actually means.
Look, part of the issue of power is to understand contending forces and compacts. And one of the issues, and it arises tangentially from a lot of the work done in South Africa, is that the social compact is largely broken because you don't have a single identifiable resonant voice of trade unions. And that disintegration came that's a subject of a thesis in and of itself. Similarly, business is broken down along all manner of lines. So there aren't resonant voices, and so the management of any compact to manage contradictions is not a possibility. But without the ability to organize society, especially between elections, I think that there's a ceding of power to the electoral process as the only. So on the issue of climate change, I agree with you. It's going to be a big change drive across the continent. And I think there are a number of similar issues that arise. If you look at the African coastline, you look at the dependence of Africa on the ocean for protein, etc., etc. A lot of that is being destroyed at the rate of knots as well. We need to develop a perspective on that because that affects families, especially in coastal communities, very, very directly. On technology, both sides of it, but I do think that AI has to be an increasing part of what we talk about because it will take away a lot of jobs of what we assume, especially in the bureaucracy and so on. On the issues of the definitions, I agree. I thought I was talking about that. Part of what we don't have, and there's a great ease with which we talk about entrepreneurship and so on. Are entrepreneurs employed or not employed? What is self-employment actually? What criteria should you use? If the ILO had to overlay their own definitions for decent work, would that apply to people who are self-employed? What about casualization then? What about all of the other issues that we take for granted in a context where people are employed frequently in a very highly structured, formalized environment. What happens when you don't have that? What kind of protection is there for people then? These, I think, are the kinds of issues that we need to engage with because they're also forward-looking. And similarly, you know, if you move out of the urban context into the rural context, and you look at what passes for work in on small sort of agricultural holdings in rural areas, it may be 2 hours a week of sort of just trying to cultivate something that doesn't really take off. All of those things are included in the numbers of those who are employed, giving you this greatly inflated number of 92.1% of labor, economically active people employed on the African continent. It's the very basis of that I think we must challenge on a continuing basis. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I accept that in the quest to tackle all the challenges that arise from inequality, unemployment, we have no choice but to think about power relations. We have no choice but to think about climate change. We have no choice but to think about technology and its ability to help us leapfrog. But I don't expect that in the kind of talk that we've done today, that you can touch meaningfully on all of these. Really, I don't think it serves any particular purpose. What I do expect is that we in Africa will develop the capacity to do solid climate change work that will contribute in a meaningful way to the search for a much better future. We in Africa will think a lot more in terms of how to use new technologies to bypass many of the things that have been done elsewhere. There's no need to recreate everything. So African countries must have policies that allow them to take advantage, full advantage of the new knowledge that exists around the world. How do you use them? I'm not sure it serves any particular purpose if in the 12-minute talk you covered all of these areas. So that's nobody can deny the need for us to do these things more appropriately, more professionally, in a much better way. On the issue of power relations, we did talk about the need for us to have policies that directly deal with the employment challenges, as opposed to relying them to be a spin-off from other growth activities. Of course, it calls for a certain kind of power relationship to do that. I do get worried sometimes, though, as an African, when I observe that a discussion of power relations in South Africa is assumed to be the only one that is valid for the rest of Africa. That worries me, in the sense that almost every African country has its own set of power challenges that need to be confronted. Democracy is something that has been tackled differently across the region. And as a result of those differences, the new set of power relations that you find, whether it's Francophone Africa or Anglophone Africa or East of Africa, Southern Africa, very different. And these things need to be considered. There isn't any one way to tackle that. Corruption, for example, is an offspring from all of this. But corruption in different parts of Africa plays out very differently. The scope is different. The institutions that allow that to happen are quite different. And the consequences and the impact on the economy is also quite different. So I would like us to be a lot more broad in our discussion of power relations in the region and how these affect the types of policies that we put in place and how those policies lead to outcomes and the effects on different types of people.
Thank you. We need to close the session. I'm encouraged about the fact that people want to say stuff. That's the whole point, really. And the suggestion about the women on farms was also a wonderful suggestion, and we'll weave that into the program somehow during the course of the day. But we would like you to all feel that at any point you can contribute what you want to contribute. In a sense, the raised platform is a bit of a problem. That's not how we're envisaging the day. But anyway, thank you very much for your participation in this first section that set the framework.